What happens when the most feared crime boss in the city grabs a waitress by the wrist, threatens to break her hand, and she doesn't apologize? Not a flinch. Not a tear. Not the desperate, humiliated scramble of a woman trying to make a powerful man feel powerful again. Instead, she looked him dead in the eyes, pulled her hand back with the slow, deliberate calm of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment, and said something so quiet, so impossibly controlled, that every person inside Ristorante Bellagio forgot how to breathe. Because in that single, suspended heartbeat, the most dangerous man in San Aurelio didn't see a waitress anymore. He saw a threat. And he had absolutely no idea why. In the city of San Aurelio, the name Adrian Volkov wasn't spoken. It was carried. Quietly. Carefully. The way you carry something that could detonate if handled incorrectly. The 36-year-old controlled everything that actually mattered: the shipping docks, the underground casinos buried beneath the city's luxury hotels, the politicians who smiled for cameras on Sunday and collected envelopes on Monday. His legitimate empire generated enough clean revenue to make any forensic accountant weep with admiration. None of that was why people didn't say his name. They didn't say it because 3 years ago a city councilman had made the catastrophic mistake of calling Volkov Continental a criminal enterprise in a public hearing. The councilman had suffered a medically inexplicable series of misfortunes in the 72 hours that followed. Nobody proved anything. Nobody tried very hard. Adrian Volkov wasn't loud about his power. The city already understood who owned it. Which made that quiet Thursday night at Ristorante Bellagio so utterly, historically extraordinary. Because Lena Alvarez was nobody. A 23-year-old waitress in a stiff black uniform, surviving on split tips and 4 hours of sleep, carrying a secret so dangerous that the moment she whispered it across that candlelit table, the most powerful man in the room forgot, just for one breathless second, that he was supposed to be the threat. Buckle up. By the time this is over, you will never look at courage the same way again. The first signal traveled to Ristorante Bellagio's staff at 9:11 p.m., 3 minutes before the black SUVs appeared at the curb. Not as a shout. Not as an announcement. As a current, invisible, electric, understood immediately by every person it passed through. A junior line cook received a text from his cousin at the parking structure on Via Castellan. He read it once. Set his phone face down on the stainless steel prep counter. And said 2 words to the nearest person without looking up. He's here. By the time those words reached the floor, the entire architecture of the evening had reorganized itself around them. The head chef checked every plate, leaving his pass with clinical focus. The sommelier conducted a rapid silent inventory of his most significant vintages. Paolo, the junior waiter, dropped an entire tray of dessert glasses. Nobody turned to look. At the entrance, Claude Renard, the maitre d', a composed silver-haired Frenchman who had spent 22 years cultivating an imperviousness to surprise, looked through the frosted glass panel and felt the blood leave his face with a speed he would later describe to his wife as genuinely educational. 3 black Escalades had materialized at the curb with the silent coordinated precision of a military operation. Adrian Volkov stepped out. He was tall. Broad through the shoulders in a way his charcoal wool overcoat did nothing to diminish. Dark hair swept back from a face that registered primarily as severe. The jaw set in a line so permanent it looked geological. Behind him, 2 men in dark suits moved with the practiced efficiency of people for whom anticipating violence had ceased to be a job and become simply a way of perceiving the world. Marco Reyes fell into position a half-step behind Adrian's left shoulder. 41 years old, broad and contained, wearing a jacket that fit well enough to conceal what was underneath. His eyes swept the room before Adrian crossed the threshold. Cataloging exits. Identifying risks. Finding the 2 plainclothes detectives nursing mineral water at the bar and dismissing them as irrelevant in the time it takes to blink. Mr. Volkov, your usual table. Adrian walked past Claude without acknowledgement. The dining room's ambient hum dropped several decibels as he moved through it. Forks paused mid-air. Eyes darted sideways and quickly away. Nobody stared directly at Adrian Volkov. That was the unspoken rule of San Aurelio, as fundamental and non-negotiable as gravity. The floor manager found Lena Alvarez in the back corridor. Pressed a menu into her hands. His face carried the expression of a man delivering a death sentence he hadn't written. "Table 9, he said. "Right now." Lena looked at the menu. Then at him. At the specific pallor and perspiration his face was currently presenting. She understood immediately what it meant and what it would cost her and what the alternative was. She rolled her shoulders back, pushed through the swing doors, and crossed the marble floor toward table 9 with the calm, professional neutrality of a woman who had decided, in the space of a single breath, that whatever was waiting for her there was simply the next thing that needed to be handled. She had no idea how profoundly and permanently true that was. Lena had worked the floor at Ristorante Bellagio for 11 months. She had served temperamental celebrities, managed drunk investment bankers, and once talked a bride through a complete emotional collapse while simultaneously coordinating a 6-course rehearsal dinner for 40 people. She was not, by any reasonable measure, a woman who rattled easily. But crossing the marble floor toward table 9, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The specific, cellular awareness of genuine danger. Adrian Volkov sat at the center of the booth like a man who had personally selected the chair, the table, and the city it sat in. Deep in quiet conversation with Marco, his voice pitched too low to carry, his expression carved from something harder than patience. The two suited men flanking the booth didn't sit so much as occupy space, their eyes tracking every movement with the flat mechanical alertness of surveillance cameras. Lena steadied her breathing. Approached with the professional neutrality that 11 months had made automatic. "Good evening." Still or sparkling water? Adrian didn't look up. Marco glanced at her the way a man glances at furniture. Sparkling. And the Barolo. 2015. She retrieved the wine. Returned with the full silver service. Began to pour with the level, practiced stability of someone who had done this 10,000 times. What happened next took 3 seconds. The conversation at the booth shifted suddenly. Marco slid a document across the table. Adrian leaned forward sharply to examine it, his elbow moving back with a force and speed the careful geometry of the service hadn't accounted for. The elbow connected with the edge of her tray. Deep red Barolo arced through the air and landed across the white cuff of Adrian Volkov's shirt with a sound that was, in itself, completely unremarkable. The silence that followed was not. It arrived with the totality of a power outage, sudden, complete, and felt in the body before the mind processed it. Forks on china. Conversation. The soft jazz from the quartet. All of it gone in a single heartbeat. Adrian looked down at his cuff. Then, with the slow, terrifying deliberateness of a man who was never in a hurry, he raised his eyes to her face. His hand came off the table. Closed around her wrist. Not violently, that was the most frightening part. Almost gently. The way a trap is gentle in the half-second before it closes. His grip was iron. And when he spoke, his voice was pitched for her ears alone, a low controlled murmur that carried more menace than a shout ever could. "Serve that drink again." He held her gaze without blinking. "And I'll break your hand." The floor manager went the color of chalk. Paolo took 2 instinctive steps backward. Every person in the room waited for the same thing. The apology. The trembling. The desperate, humiliated scramble. Lena looked down at the hand locked around her wrist. Then she looked back up. And with a composure so complete it bordered on terrifying, she began, slowly, deliberately, without any sign of fear, to pull her hand away. His grip released. Not because she had freed herself. Because he had chosen, for reasons nobody in the room could explain, to let go. In the ringing suspended silence that followed, Lena Alvarez looked the most feared man in San Aurelio directly in the eyes and said 4 words that didn't shake, didn't rise, and didn't ask for anything. You should let go. They landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. And the ripples that followed would not stop for a very long time. In 11 years working for Adrian Volkov, Marco Reyes had watched his boss reduce grown men to tears without raising his voice. Had seen seasoned criminals physically tremble under the weight of Adrian's silence. Had witnessed a city councilman wet himself in a parking garage simply because Adrian had looked at him for too long. He had never seen anyone do what this waitress was doing. She was still standing there. Not frozen. Not calculating an exit. Simply standing at the edge of the booth with her dark eyes level and unblinking and her breathing so controlled it was almost meditative. The wine stains soaked into the tablecloth beside her. The fallen glass had rolled to a stop against the bread basket. Nobody had moved to clean anything because nobody in the vicinity had remembered how to move. Marco's hand rested on the grip of his weapon inside his jacket. He didn't draw it. Not here. Not with 40 civilians and 2 detectives in the room. But his eyes communicated very clearly what would happen the moment they stepped outside. Adrian had released her wrist. Not because she'd freed herself. Because he had chosen to let go. There was a profound difference and every watching person understood it instinctively. He leaned back slowly, his dark eyes conducting a forensic examination of her face. Looking for the crack in the composure. The hairline fracture that would reveal the handler, the setup, the angle. He wasn't finding it. Her uniform was standard issue. Dark hair pulled back practically. No jewelry, no pretension. 23 years old at the absolute most. By every visible measure exactly what she appeared to be, a quiet, unremarkable girl surviving on split tips in a restaurant that barely noticed she existed. And yet, she hadn't apologized. Hadn't begged. Hadn't cried, flinched, or broken eye contact. She had told him to let go. And the specific quality of fearlessness behind it wasn't bravado. Marco knew bravado, knew its performance quality, the conscious effortful brightness of someone pitching themselves against something larger. This was different. Something rooted at a depth that performance didn't reach. She wasn't trying to be unafraid. She simply was. Marco stepped forward, planting himself at her shoulder close enough that she'd feel the displacement of air. Close enough that the message required no translation. She didn't turn to look at him. Her eyes stayed on Adrian's face with that grounded steadiness, registering Marco's arrival with the calm efficiency of someone who had already accounted for that variable and moved past it. His jaw tightened. Adrian raised one hand from the table. A single imperceptible gesture. Marco stopped. The room held its breath. Adrian leaned forward, bringing his face closer to hers by a calculated few inches. When he spoke, his voice was so controlled, so perfectly calibrated, it seemed to occupy the silence rather than break it. "You really don't want to do this," Lena said. She said it before he could speak. The room had moved past gasping. It had arrived at the place beyond gasping, the raw, completely present stillness of people witnessing something that doesn't happen and understanding, at some wordless level, that they will be describing this moment for the rest of their lives. Marco watched it land in Adrian's face. Watched something cold and calculating shift behind those dark eyes. Not anger, the hot reflexive fury of challenged authority. Something colder. More considered. The expression of a man who has just received information he didn't have and is already, with rapid unsentimental efficiency, integrating it into his understanding of the situation. She had said it like someone stating a fact. Not pitching her voice to the room for protection. Quietly. Directly. Person to person. With the grounded certainty of someone who already knows the outcome and is offering the other party one opportunity to arrive at it voluntarily. Adrian studied her for a long moment. Then leaned forward one final inch. "And why is that?" he asked. Lena held his gaze for exactly one beat. Then she leaned forward too, closing the remaining distance across the candlelit table, and whispered something that didn't reach the neighboring tables, didn't reach the bar, didn't reach Marco despite every straining instinct in his body. Something intended for Adrian Volkov alone. Marco watched his employer's face as the words arrived. And what he saw there, in the fractional unguarded second before Adrian's control reasserted itself, was something so far outside 11 years of careful observation that his mind, reaching for a category, found nothing. Adrian Volkov looked, for one breathless and impossible moment, like a man who had just heard something he had spent 15 years making certain he would never hear. He looked afraid. The fear lasted exactly 1 second. Marco counted it. Automatically, the way he counted everything that mattered. Then Adrian's control came back down over his expression like a blast door closing. Smooth. Total. Leaving no visible seam. If Marco hadn't been close enough to see the exact moment it happened, he would have doubted it had happened at all. But he had been close enough. And he didn't doubt it. Which meant that whatever this woman had whispered across the candlelit table had done something to Adrian Volkov that nothing in 11 years had managed. It had found a gap in the architecture. Had slipped through something that Adrian had spent a considerable portion of his adult life ensuring had no gaps. Marco needed to know what it was. More urgently, he needed to know who had sent her. Because in his professional experience, people arriving at Adrian's table carrying information capable of producing that expression had been sent by someone with both the knowledge and the resources to weaponize it. And people like that didn't present themselves as waitresses in stiff black uniforms. Unless that was precisely the point. He stepped forward with a speed and directness several degrees more urgent than his previous approach. This wasn't the measured advance of a man delivering a message. This was a man removing a variable. Boss. Low and tight, directed entirely at Adrian. We should. Marco. 2 syllables. Flat, quiet, carrying the specific terminal authority of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in input. Adrian's eyes hadn't moved from Lena's face. Marco stopped. Took 1 step back. The step cost him something he filed away for later. The dining room had passed through several distinct atmospheric phases in the last 4 minutes and was now occupying new and stranger territory. Not quite silence and not quite sound. The collective suspended state of a room full of people who have recognized they are present at something significant and have consequently forgotten how to be present at anything else. The jazz quartet had stopped playing entirely. 3 tables had glasses suspended at intermediate points between surface and mouth. A man near the window had been holding a forkful of pasta approximately 8 inches from his face for so long the pasta had begun to droop. Nobody left. That was the remarkable thing. In a room full of wealthy, powerful people with every resource required to remove themselves from proximity to genuine danger, nobody left. They sat. They watched. They breathed as quietly as they could manage. Because when something genuinely unprecedented was happening in front of you, the body simply refused to look away. Adrian was speaking again. Too low to carry. His posture projecting a stillness so complete it had started to feel, paradoxically, like its own form of pressure. Like the stillness of a very deep place. And here was the thing Marco kept returning to: Lena wasn't performing. He had watched countless people sit across from Adrian over the years. Politicians, prosecutors, rivals, informants. Every single one had constructed a version of themselves capable of surviving Adrian's undivided attention. Had held their faces carefully. Managed their breathing. This woman was doing none of that. She was simply present. Direct and entirely herself, with no visible distance between what she felt and what she showed. Either the most sophisticated performance Marco had ever encountered, or something else entirely. He was becoming increasingly certain it was something else entirely. Dmitri caught Marco's eye across the table. The compressed communication of 2 people who had worked together long enough to conduct entire conversations between blinks. Dimitri's contribution translated approximately to, "What in the name of everything reasonable is happening right now?" Marco's response, "I don't know yet." "Stay ready." At the table something had shifted. Adrian had straightened. Not with tension, with the specific realignment of a man who has made a decision and felt the shape of the immediate future change around it. "Sit down," he said quietly. The room received these two words with the collective physical response of people who had been holding significant tension for several minutes and had been given, if not permission to release it, at least a reason to recalibrate. It wasn't an invitation. Everyone understood this. But it also, unmistakably, wasn't a threat. Lena looked at the empty seat across from him. She sat down. Not with the collapsed grateful relief of someone offered mercy. With a composure so naturally inhabited that Marco had the disorienting sensation of watching the entire power geometry of the booth silently, irrevocably reorganize itself around her arrival. Adrian studied her across the candlelit table. The wine stain had spread further into the white linen between them. Dark and irregular and past saving. "Who are you?" he asked. 4 words. Simple. Stripped of everything except the genuine, unadorned need to know. And the way Adrian Volkov asked them, low and deliberate, with none of his usual rhetorical architecture, told Marco something that settled into his chest like a stone dropping into deep water. His employer already suspected he knew the answer. And the answer was something that should not have been possible. Lena folded her hands on the table. The candlelight caught the sharp, quiet intelligence in her dark eyes. She leaned forward and spoke in a voice so low that Marco, standing less than 4 feet away, caught only fragments. A name. 3 syllables. Old and buried. He watched the name arrive in Adrian's face. Watched something vast and ancient move behind those dark, controlled eyes like a depth charge detonating far below the surface, invisible from above but measurable in the way everything changed afterward. And Adrian Volkov looked, for the second time in 4 minutes, like a man standing on ground he had believed was solid. That had just proven otherwise. There were exactly 4 people alive who knew that name. Adrian had built this certainty the way he built everything that mattered, carefully, expensively, with the thorough unsentimental attention to detail that left no meaningful margin for error. He had verified it through independent channels. Had revisited the verification at intervals with the quiet private discipline of a man who understood that the things most worth protecting were the things most worth checking. 4 people. Accounted for. The name buried in the deep lightless place where he kept the things that couldn't be destroyed and therefore had to be contained. None of them were her. He kept his face still. It cost him more than keeping his face still had cost him in a very long time. He had maintained his composure through things that had broken stronger men. Rooms where people were trying to kill him. Tables where men lied about things he already knew were lies. A funeral in the rain 7 years ago representing the single greatest failure of his adult life, while 40 people measured his grief and calculated what it meant for their futures. He had kept his face still through all of it. This was harder. Because this wasn't a threat or a deception or a grief he had prepared to perform correctly. This was something arriving from a direction he had sealed. From a part of his past he had processed and finished and built subsequent years on top of, the way you build on ground you have tested and found solid. And solid ground was moving. "Say that again," he said. His voice came out level. Measured. Giving away nothing except the request itself, which was already giving away more than he intended. Because Adrian Volkov did not ask questions he didn't know the answers to. That was a structural principle of survival. And here he was asking a 23-year-old waitress a question whose answer he genuinely, completely did not know. Lena leaned forward the precise necessary amount and said the name again. The same way she said everything else. With that maddening, unshakable calm that had stopped feeling like composure and started feeling like armor he didn't yet understand. "Who told you that name?" Adrian asked. She looked at him with eyes that had no business carrying the knowledge they were carrying. "My father," Lena said. 2 words. Delivered without theater. Without the strategic pause of someone landing their most significant piece of information. Simply stated. Clean and direct. The effect moved through Adrian like something physical. Not visibly. Nothing moved in his face that Marco could have pointed to and named. No intake of breath. No shift in posture. But inside, something that had been a certainty for 15 years cracked along a fault line he hadn't known was there. And in the space the crack opened, something old and complicated and not entirely resolved came flooding back with the unstoppable vividness of things that were never as finished as you told yourself they were. A February night. A freezing corridor behind the Eastern Dock warehouses. The specific visceral clarity of a situation in which the arithmetic has become very simple and very final. And a man stepping out of the shadows. Adrian looked at Lena's face. At the dark, steady eyes. At the fearlessness he now understood completely, not a performance, not a mystery. An inheritance. Passed down from a man who had demonstrated, in a freezing corridor 15 years ago, what genuine courage looked like when it had nothing to prove. He understood where she had gotten it. Understood it in his body before his mind caught up. Your father, he said. Flat. Careful. The voice of a man reciting something back to hear it in the air. To test its weight outside his own skull. Lena nodded. What is his name? She told him. 3 syllables. Marco heard them clearly. A name from a chapter of Adrian's history so sealed that hearing it spoken aloud in this restaurant felt structurally wrong, like hearing a dead language spoken fluently by a stranger on a street corner. Adrian said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had descended to a register so stripped of its authority that it sounded, just barely and just for a moment, almost human. Your father, he said slowly, is dead. Not a threat. Not a correction. The careful, measured statement of a man reciting a load-bearing fact. One that the architecture of several important things had depended on being true for 15 years. Lena looked at him across the ruined tablecloth. The wine stain spread between them like a dark map of somewhere neither had planned to go tonight. The expression on her face shifted. Not into fear or grief. Into something quiet and private and absolutely certain. The expression of a person who has known the truth for a long time and has been waiting, with the patience of someone who understood that the right moment would eventually arrive, for the opportunity to deliver it. No, she said simply. A pause. Clean and devastating as a fault line opening. You just think he is. Outside on Via Aurelia, San Aurelio moved through its cold and different Thursday night entirely unaware that at table 9, in the amber light of a guttering candle, the most carefully constructed certainty in Adrian Volkov's life had just been taken apart in 6 words. And that nothing, not the city, not the empire, not 15 years of architecture, would be exactly the same after tonight. The silence that followed was a different species from every silence that had preceded it. The earlier silences had been about fear, the held breath compression of a room making itself small in the presence of something dangerous. Understandable. Rational. The entirely correct response of organisms that had identified a threat and were managing their exposure to it. This silence was something else entirely. Denser. More charged. The specific atmospheric pressure of a moment in which something load-bearing, something an entire structure of subsequent reality has been built upon, is being seriously considered as possibly not true at all. It was the silence of a foundation being questioned. Adrian sat completely still. Hands flat on the table. The candle burning between them with an indifference that felt almost offensive. The wine stain dark and permanent against the white linen. The business that had brought him here tonight rendered entirely irrelevant by 6 words from a woman he had never seen before and now could not look away from. That is not possible, he said. Not as dismissal. Not with the flat terminal authority he used to end conversations. He said it the way you press your thumb against a bruise, not because you want it to hurt but because you need to confirm it still does. running a structural check on something he had relied on for 15 years and was not prepared to find compromised. Lena didn't argue. Didn't rush to fill the silence with justification or evidence. She sat with what she had said and let it breathe with the patient, immovable confidence of someone who already knows where the conversation is going and understands the other person simply needs time to get there. She reached into the narrow pocket of her apron, placed a photograph on the table, slid it toward Adrian with 2 fingers, the way you move something fragile, then withdrew her hand and waited. The photograph was old. Edges worn soft with the erosion of something handled frequently over many years. Colors faded to the warm, imperfect palette of analog photography, that slightly unreal, slightly melancholy register that digital imaging had eliminated along with all the other beautiful imperfections it had decided were inefficiencies. 2 men standing outside a warehouse on the Eastern Dock District. One younger, thinner through the face and frame, hard-eyed and forward-leaning with the tension of someone in the early dangerous chapters of a life that was going to demand everything from them. Dark hair. Jaw already set in the line it had never since abandoned. Recognizably. Unmistakably. Inarguably Adrian. The other man had his hand on young Adrian's shoulder. Adrian looked at the photograph. What moved through his face in the seconds that followed was a sequence that Marco would spend considerable time afterward trying to find language for. Recognition, immediate and physical, arriving in the body before the mind. Something that in the fraction of a second before it was managed looked remarkably like grief. And beneath both, moving through the deepest register of Adrian's expression with the slow tectonic force of something compressed for a very long time under tremendous weight, something Marco had no word for. Relief. Complicated, costly, not entirely welcome relief. The specific relief of a man who has been carrying a version of events that left something unresolved and has just been presented with the possibility that the resolution still exists. That the account isn't closed. That the thing he thought was finished isn't finished. That there is still, against every reasonable expectation, something left to do. Adrian looked at the photograph for a long time. When he finally looked up, every layer of his composure was intact. But his eyes were doing something Marco had genuinely never seen them do. They were uncertain. Not afraid. Not weakened. But uncertain in the specific, private, deeply human way of a man who has just discovered that a door he locked and walked away from 15 years ago has been open the entire time. "Where did you get this?" Adrian asked. His voice was quiet, stripped of its professional register. Almost gentle. "He kept it," Lena said. Matching his register naturally, the way 2 people's voices match when they're talking about the same thing and the thing matters to both of them. He kept everything. Something moved in Adrian's jaw. The almost imperceptible tightening of a man receiving information that costs something to receive and is paying it quietly without display. Around them, the restaurant continued its careful performance of normality. Utterly unaware that the man who owned this city had just been handed proof that the most significant dead man in his past had been alive for every single one of the 15 years he had spent believing otherwise. "He saved your life once," Lena said. She held his gaze steadily across the candlelit table. Dark eyes carrying the full weight of everything she had come here tonight to say. "And he never asked you for anything in return." The candle guttered once. Steadied. Burned on. Something shifted at table 9 that had nothing to do with empire or city or 15 years of carefully constructed distance between Adrian Volkov and anything that required him to feel it directly. Something older than all of it. And considerably more important. Then Marco's phone vibrated once against his ribs. He read the message. And felt the temperature of the evening change in a way that had nothing to do with the restaurant's climate control. Because outside on Via Aurelia, 2 of their vehicles had just been joined by a third. One that didn't belong to them. One that had been parked at the corner for 40 minutes. Watching. There was a night 15 years ago that Adrian Volkov had never spoken about to another living person. Not to Marco. Not to the men who had bled beside him in the organization's brutal early years. Not to the two women he had briefly and disastrously allowed close enough to matter. Not to the priest he had visited once at 24 in a moment of private crisis he had spent subsequent years burying under momentum and the consuming discipline of becoming the thing he had decided to become. Nobody knew about that night. Because everyone present for it was dead. Or so he had believed. February. The bone-stripping cold of a Port District winter coming off the harbor sideways, finding every gap in your clothing with focused personal malice. He had been 21, newly installed in a position of minor authority within an organization that consumed ambitious young men the way a furnace consumed wood. He had made the nearly fatal mistake of trusting someone whose loyalty had been purchased more recently and cheaply than he understood. The ambush was clean. Professional. For men in a service corridor behind the eastern dock warehouses. Adrian had been outnumbered from the moment he understood, 30 seconds too late, that the meeting he'd been directed to wasn't a meeting. He'd accounted for two of them before the third put something sharp and deep into his left side. After that the arithmetic became very simple and very final. Then the corridor changed. A fifth presence from the far shadows. Moving with speed and economy that Adrian, even diminished and bleeding, recognized as the movement of someone trained in contexts considerably more serious than gymnasiums. The situation resolved in under 40 seconds. The man crouched beside Adrian afterward, pressed a folded cloth against the wound with steady hands, and said almost nothing. No demands. No positioning. No angling for the debt he had just created. He simply looked at Adrian with calm dark eyes. Then helped him to his feet and walked away into the dark. Adrian had tried to find him afterward. Had deployed resources and called in favors. Had surfaced a name, a fragmentary history, and then 18 months later a death certificate. Verified through 2 independent sources. Filed. Accepted. Closed. He looked at Lena now. At the photograph. At the fearlessness in her dark eyes that he understood completely, not a performance, not a mystery, but an inheritance. Passed down by a man who had demonstrated in a freezing corridor what genuine courage looked like when it had nothing to prove. Lena Alvarez, he said slowly. She nodded. Something settled in his expression. The specific realignment of a man updating a load-bearing belief and feeling everything built on top of it shift and resettle on the new foundation. Behind him Marco leaned close. Carefully, precisely neutral in the way that meant anything but. Boss. The vehicle on Via Aurelia has been there 43 minutes. Plates traced to a shell company. Bresciani's people. The name landed at the table like a stone dropped into still water. Bresciani. San Aurelio's second most significant criminal organization. A man who had spent 3 years watching Adrian's empire with the patient systematic attention of someone waiting for a gap to present itself. Who understood that empires had moments of vulnerability and that the most dangerous vulnerabilities were the ones the empire didn't see coming. Adrian didn't move. His eyes stayed on Lena one moment longer. Then something resolved in his face. The rapid unsentimental efficiency of a man who has identified every variable and has made every necessary calculation. How many? He asked Marco without turning. At least 4 in the vehicle. Possibly a second unit on Via Castellan. Adrian picked up the photograph. Looked at it once. Set it back down in front of Lena. Marco leaned near his ear. Boss. This could be a trap. Adrian looked at Lena across the candlelit table. Across the wine-stained linen. Across 15 years of distance that had collapsed without warning into the length of a restaurant booth. I know, he said quietly. He wasn't talking to Marco. Marco had a system. Not documented anywhere. Not written into any protocol. Living entirely in the accumulated pressure-tested instinct of a man who had spent 11 years keeping Adrian Volkov alive in a world that had made several sincere and well-resourced attempts to make him otherwise. When something appeared too convenient, you broke it. Not metaphorically. You applied direct, unambiguous pressure and watched what happened. Genuine things and constructed things failed differently under stress. A real bone and a fabricated one responded to force in entirely distinct ways. Marco had learned this at 19 in circumstances he had never described to anyone and had never found cause to revise. He caught Adrian's eye. The compressed wordless communication of 11 years passed between them in a single exchanged glance. Adrian gave the smallest possible nod. Marco turned to Dimitri. Said nothing. Didn't need to. Dimitri moved to the table the way a pressure system moves toward a coastline, with slow-building atmospheric inevitability that reorganized the space ahead of it before it arrived. He stopped directly beside Lena's chair and placed one enormous hand flat on the table with controlled percussive force that sent cutlery jumping, crystal ringing, and produced a crack that traveled across the dining room like a starter pistol, causing every person within 15 feet to flinch backward simultaneously. The restaurant abandoned its pretense of normalcy entirely. You're in a seat that doesn't belong to you, Dimitri said. Low and dense. The tonal quality of someone for whom consequences had always flowed in one direction. He leaned down, bringing his face into her peripheral vision. I suggest you remember exactly where you are before this conversation goes somewhere you can't walk back from. Lena looked at the hand on the table. Then looked at him. And did nothing. No recoil. No sharp breath. No white-knuckled hands or reflexive press backward. Her breathing didn't change. Her shoulders didn't rise. Her eyes didn't drop. She simply looked at him with those dark level eyes and waited with the complete unhurried stillness of someone who had been still in the presence of much worse. Dimitri held the position for 5 full seconds. Marco watched the recalibration happen in the big man's face. The almost imperceptible adjustment of someone whose understanding of how a situation works has been contradicted by the situation itself. Dimitri was accustomed to resolution in 2 seconds. The absence of it at 5 was profoundly disorienting, like a step that isn't there, the lurching, destabilizing adjustment of a body that committed to something that didn't happen. He looked at Marco. Marco looked at Adrian. Adrian was leaning back with arms crossed, dark eyes conducting a thorough, unhurried examination of Lena, and what was moving behind those eyes wasn't satisfaction or surprise, though it contained traces of both. It was recognition. The reluctant private recognition of a man who has been searching for a category and has just understood the category doesn't exist because he has never encountered this particular thing before. He raised his hand. Dimitri stepped back with the seamless withdrawal of a professional pretending the last 30 seconds hadn't revealed something about his effectiveness he'd prefer unrevealed. The restaurant exhaled. Adrian placed his arms back on the table. Looked at Lena with the focused, undecorated directness of a man who has finished the preliminary work and is ready for the actual conversation. You didn't flinch, he said. The closing of a file. The recording of a result. The quiet notation of a man whose system had returned an answer he hadn't predicted and was now obligated to take seriously. Lena held his gaze evenly. I know, she said. Outside, Marco's phone vibrated once. He read the notification. Kept his face completely still. How long? Adrian asked without turning. 2 minutes, Marco said quietly. Maybe less. Adrian looked at Lena. At the worn edges of the photograph. At the woman who had walked into his restaurant tonight carrying a dead man's name and a living man's face and one piece of leverage she had already played and was now waiting, with the patient certainty of someone who had prepared for every possible outcome except this one, to discover whether it had been enough. Why are you really here? He asked. Lena had rehearsed this moment approximately 200 times. In the bathroom of the apartment she shared with Daniel, where the pipes knocked at night and fear kept hours that didn't respect the clock. On the late tram home from double shifts with her feet destroyed and the numbers running their relentless arithmetic in her head. In the dark hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the only thing preventing complete unraveling was the focused, exhausting act of preparing for a conversation she had no guarantee of ever being allowed to have. She had scripted it. Pressure tested every sentence against every possible response. Prepared for anger, dismissal, violence, the cold transactional indifference of a powerful man being asked to care about a problem that wasn't his. What she hadn't prepared for was this. For the photograph to crack something open behind those dark eyes. For the man who had grabbed her wrist 40 minutes ago to be sitting across from her now with that expression, that specific quality of unguarded, effortful attention that felt less like the scrutiny of a crime boss and more like a man trying to hear something important through 15 years of accumulated silence. She hadn't prepared for him to actually see her. She took a breath, let it out slowly, and told him the truth. Her brother's name was Daniel. 20 years old, slight and clever and constitutionally incapable of distinguishing a calculated risk from a catastrophic one. 18 months ago, during a stretch when Lena had been working double shifts and monitoring him less closely than she should have, he had gotten himself embedded in a gambling operation that had escalated with the swift, terrible momentum of these things into a debt of 34,000 euros owed to men who communicated displeasure physically. They had put Daniel in the hospital twice in 3 months. The second time had been 10 days ago. He had come home with 2 broken ribs, a fractured orbital, and a deadline. Lena had traced the debt through its organizational layers until she arrived at the name above all the other names. Had applied for every available shift at Ristorante Bellagio. Had waited with the grinding patience of someone who understood that patience wasn't a virtue but a necessity. Had prepared for 200 versions of this conversation. And then Adrian had grabbed her wrist. And something wound impossibly tight inside her for 18 months, the exhaustion, the fear, the relentless crushing weight of being the person not allowed to stop holding things together, had snapped. Not into anger. Into clarity. She was here because Daniel was running out of time. Because her father had kept one photograph and one name locked in a drawer like a life insurance policy he had prayed his children would never need. Because he had told her once, in the particular unguarded way parents tell children the things that actually matter, that the man in that photograph understood what it meant to carry a debt that couldn't be repaid in ordinary ways. She was here because she had no one else to ask. When she finished, the candle had burned to a wavering stub. Marco stood behind the booth like load-bearing architecture. Adrian had not interrupted her once. Had not shifted or recalibrated or made any of the small visible adjustments of a man waiting for a speaker to finish rather than genuinely listening. He sat with everything she had said. Then looked at Marco. "Find Daniel Alvarez," he said. Simple. Direct. The voice of a man who has located the precise shape of a debt and discovered, against every expectation, he still has the means to pay it. Cancel the debt. Marco stared at him 2 seconds longer than was professional. All of it? All of it. He looked back at Lena. Outside on Via Aurelia, the vehicle that had been waiting 43 minutes finally made its decision. And the doors opened. The doors opened. Marco had the phone to his ear before the first figure cleared the vehicle. Low, clipped, compressed. For on foot Via Aurelia. Second unit confirmed Via Castellan. They're moving. He looked at Adrian across the booth. Now. Adrian didn't move immediately. This was the thing about him that had always unnerved people who didn't understand it and reassured people who did. In moments of escalating urgency, when every instinct screamed for immediate action, Adrian Volkov went still. Not frozen. Not paralyzed. Still in the deliberate way of a man who understood that the quality of the next decision mattered more than the speed of it. Who had learned through the expensive education of genuine danger that the difference between a good response and a catastrophic one was almost always found in the 2 seconds most people skipped. He looked at Lena. She had heard Marco. Had processed it with that rapid, efficient calm he had stopped being surprised by. Her eyes were steady. Alert. Carrying none of the wild-cornered panic the situation objectively warranted in a civilian with no training and no preparation for what was unfolding 40 feet beyond the restaurant's frosted glass. She looked like her father. The observation arrived without sentiment and landed with the structural weight of something that settled a question he hadn't known he was still asking. "Stay close to me," he said. Not a request. The direct, unadorned instruction of a man who has made a decision about what he is responsible for and intends to honor it completely. Lena nodded once. Adrian stood. Buttoned his coat. Turned to Marco. Back in trance. Now. Enzo's unit takes the Via Castellan position before Bresciani's people reach the corner. Nobody moves on the restaurant, 40 civilians and 2 detectives, and I will not give Bresciani the chaos he needs. We take this outside on our terms. Understood, Marco said, already moving. The 2 suited men melted into motion simultaneously, moving toward their positions with the quiet practiced efficiency of a machine designed for exactly this and waiting, with professional patience, for exactly this to arrive. Dimitri materialized at Lena's shoulder. Lena stood. Picked up the photograph from the table. Folded it with careful, unhurried hands and placed it back in her apron pocket. The movement so composed, so completely unrushed in the context of what was happening, that Dimitri watched it with the slightly dazed expression of a man whose model of crisis behavior was being revised in real time. Adrian paused at the booth's edge. Turned back once. The room was watching him with the held unanimous attention of 40 people who had understood that something had shifted from tense to dangerous and that the man moving through their midst was the variable that determined whether the danger stayed outside or came in. He looked at Claude. Close the restaurant. Full refund for every table. Do it now and do it calmly. A pause. And tell your friends at the bar there's activity on Via Aurelia. They'll want to be outside. Claude nodded with the rapid, grateful efficiency of a man handed clear instructions in a situation that had stopped having any. Adrian turned and walked toward the kitchen. The service alley hit them with the full, uncompromising cold of a San Aurelio autumn night. Salt water and diesel and the distant sounds of a city that had no idea what was happening in its midst. 3 of Adrian's men were already positioned. Adrian assessed the alley in 2 seconds. Then Marco's phone rang. He answered. Listened for 4 seconds. His face went pale. The sommelier. Federico. Bresciani's payroll for 8 months. He's inside with 2 others who came in as customers. A pause that carried the weight of everything wrong with the next sentence. They have Claude. The alley went very quiet. Adrian turned to Lena. His voice was even, stripped of everything except what it needed to carry. Your brother. Is there anything Bresciani could use to find him? Lena went still. Then, the hospital intake form. 10 days ago I listed our father's address as secondary contact. She met Adrian's eyes. The calculation completed itself between them in the space of a single exchanged look. Bresciani's been watching you for 3 years. If he found me tonight. He found your father, Adrian said. Not a question. Lena's face didn't collapse. Didn't perform the fear that had just moved through her like ice water. The jaw tightened. The eyes hardened into something that was, in that specific moment, so completely her father's expression that Adrian felt it like a physical impact in the center of his chest. Then we need to move, she said. Adrian looked at her for 1 moment. Then turned to Marco with the complete decisive authority of a man who has identified every variable and is now simply executing. 3 teams. First team with me through the service entrance, we take Federico and get Claude out. Second team to Daniel Alvarez, the address Lena will give you, moving now. A pause. 1 beat. Third team to her father. Marco was already on the phone. And Bresciani's vehicle? Dimitri asked. Leave it, Adrian said. Bresciani isn't in the vehicle. He's watching from somewhere with a direct sight line to the entrance, waiting to see what comes out. He straightened his coat. So we're going to give him something to see. He looked at Lena. Stay with Dimitri. The moment Claude is clear and the interior is secured, he takes you directly to your father. Something moved through his eyes that was beyond operational. Beyond empire and reputation and 15 years of carefully constructed distance between himself and anything that required him to feel it directly. I promised you nothing would happen to your brother. I'm extending that promise. Lena looked at him. Why? She asked. Not with suspicion. With the genuine, unguarded directness of someone who needed the true answer rather than the convenient one. Adrian held her gaze. Because your father stepped out of the dark for me when he had no reason to, he said. And I have spent 15 years understanding that there is no version of the man I was trying to become that doesn't account for that. A pause. This is me accounting for it. The alley held its cold salt-smelling silence for one moment. Then Adrian turned to the service entrance and pushed through it. What followed in the next 11 minutes inside Ristorante Bellagio was the kind of thing that the two city detectives, repositioned on Via Aurelia per Claude's instruction, would spend subsequent weeks attempting to formally document and privately failing to entirely believe. It was precise. Controlled. Over before Bresciani's vehicle on Via Aurelia had processed that the operation had failed. Federico and his two associates were detained without a single civilian casualty, without a single broken piece of the restaurant's considerable inventory of expensive glassware, and without the discharge of a single weapon. Claude was released from the cold storage room where he had been secured and emerged into the service corridor with his composure remarkably intact and his jacket only slightly disheveled. He straightened it immediately. The 2015 Barolo, he said to no one in particular, with the specific aggrieved dignity of a man whose professional standards had survived considerably worse, has been completely ruined. Dimitri had Lena in the armored Escalade and moving through San Aurelio streets within 4 minutes. The city slid past the tinted windows in its indifferent continuous luminous flow. Her phone rang at the 7-minute mark. Daniel is with my people, Adrian's voice said. Clean and direct. He's unharmed. The debt is cancelled. He'll be home within the hour. Lena closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Thank you, she said. A pause. Your father's address, Adrian said. My team arrived 4 minutes ago. He's safe. Bresciani's people hadn't reached him. Another pause, longer than the first, carrying in its length something that couldn't be entirely contained in the operational register he was using. He was sitting in his kitchen drinking coffee and reading. He appeared to be entirely unsurprised that I knew where he lived. Something moved through Lena's chest that was too large and too complicated and too long overdue to have a simple name. He wouldn't be, she said softly. He's been waiting. The silence on the line had a different quality than the silences earlier in the evening. Not pressurized or charged. Simply the silence of two people sitting with the extraordinary improbable fact of what the last 2 hours had been. I'll have Dimitri take you to him, Adrian said finally. I know, Lena said. Another pause. Miss Alvarez. His voice had descended to its simplest register. The one she had heard for the first time when he'd looked at the photograph and the control had come down and there had been, briefly and completely, just a man sitting with something true. Your father saved my life 15 years ago in a freezing corridor on the eastern docks. I looked for him afterward for a long time. I wanted to, he stopped. Reconsidered the sentence. I owed him something I had no way to pay. Lena was very still. He never thought of it as a debt, she said quietly. That wasn't why he did it. I know, Adrian said. That was always the thing about him. Her father's house was a narrow whitewashed building on a quiet street in the Vero district, 20 minutes from Ristorante Bellagio by car and approximately 15 years from the eastern dock warehouses by every other available measure. The lights were on. Dimitri opened the car door. Lena stepped out into the cold night and stood for a moment on the pavement with the photograph in her pocket and the entire impossible weight of the evening settling around her like something finally, completely put down. The front door opened before she reached it. Her father stood in the doorway. 61 years old. Slight and quiet, carrying in the particular unhurried stillness of his posture the quality of a man who has made his peace with most things and is therefore entirely unburdened by fear of what comes next. His dark eyes, calm and direct and belonging to a face that age had made gentler without making it less certain, moved from Lena to the car at the curb and back to Lena. He looked at the pocket where the photograph was. Something moved through his face. Old and complicated and not entirely resolved and real in the irreducible way of things carried for a very long time. Did he understand? He asked. Lena looked at her father. Thought about a candlelit table and a wine-stained tablecloth and a man who had looked at a photograph of his younger self and felt something vast and old shift behind his eyes. Thought about an alley and a clear direct voice saying this is me accounting for it. Thought about a phone call and a silence that had carried in its length everything the words around it couldn't quite contain. Yes, she said. He understood. Her father nodded slowly. Stepped back from the doorway. Held it open. Come inside, he said. I'll make coffee. Lena crossed the threshold into the warm-lit interior. Into the smell of coffee and old books and the specific irreplaceable atmosphere of a place that had always been, regardless of everything outside it, entirely safe. She sat at the kitchen table. Placed the photograph on the surface between them. Her father looked at it for a long moment. At the two men outside the warehouse. At the hand on the young man's shoulder. At 15 years compressed into a single image that had apparently, from the very beginning, been waiting to finish what it started. He picked it up. Set it face down on the table. And poured the coffee. 3 weeks later an envelope arrived at Lena's apartment. No return address. Heavyweight cream stock. Inside, a single card. 4 sentences in Adrian Volkov's handwriting, precise and controlled and carrying even in written form the compressed authority of a man who chose his words with the deliberate economy of someone who understood their weight. Daniel's debt is erased. His name is clear. What he does with that is his. Your father gave me something 15 years ago that I have spent every year since trying to deserve. I am still working on it. You are your father's daughter. Stay away from this world, Lena. It is not kind to brave people. V. Lena read it once. Set it on the kitchen table beside the photograph, which she had moved from her apron pocket to the windowsill above the sink where the morning light caught it every day and made the faded colors briefly improbably vivid. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone. Not to call anyone. Simply to check, with the quiet practical efficiency of a woman who had spent 18 months managing a crisis and had not yet entirely recalibrated to a world in which the crisis was over, that Daniel had come home. He had. He was asleep in his room with the door slightly open the way he had slept since childhood. The apartment was quiet. The city outside did what it always did, moved through its vast indifferent luminous night entirely unaware of what had happened inside it. Lena set her phone down. Looked at the card. Looked at the photograph. And Lena Alvarez, who had walked into Ristorante Bellagio as a quiet, invisible waitress surviving on split tips and 4 hours of sleep, who had stood at the edge of a booth and looked the most dangerous man in the city directly in the eye and refused at every moment to be anything less than exactly who her father had raised her to be, did something she had not permitted herself to do once during the entire extraordinary evening that had changed everything. She closed her eyes. And let herself breathe. Fully. Completely. Without the sustained muscular tension of a person holding everything together by force of will. Without the fear. Without the arithmetic. Without the crushing relentless weight of a crisis that had required her to be stronger than she actually was for considerably longer than anyone should have to be. Just breath. In a body that had carried more than it should have had to carry and had carried it anyway. Because that was what her father had taught her strength actually meant, not the absence of weight but the decision to keep walking under it until you reached somewhere you could finally, safely, put it down. She was here. Daniel was home. Her father was safe. And somewhere in the city, in the tower of glass and steel that looked out over San Aurelio from its highest point, a man was sitting at his desk in the late quiet of an evening that had not gone as planned, reading a message confirming all 3 objectives secured and all threats neutralized and the operational situation resolved. He read it once, set his phone face down on the desk, and looked out at the city. His city. Built over 15 years from raw ambition and the specific defining knowledge that a man he had never properly thanked had once decided, in a freezing corridor, that Adrian Volkov's life was worth saving. He had spent 15 years trying to be worth it. He wasn't finished. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, he felt something he hadn't felt since a cold February night on the eastern docks when a quiet man with steady hands had pressed a cloth against his side and asked for nothing in return. He felt like the account was moving. Not closed. Not finished. But moving. In the right direction. For the first time. If this story held you from the first threatened hand to the final cup of coffee, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act clearly inside it. And that sometimes the debts we think are closed are simply waiting for the right person to walk through the door and show us they were never finished at all. Because some things were always meant to come full circle. They just needed time.